expert, just give me a second for that, and then we'll let the folks in the radio and then I will wait a couple of seconds. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellen Myers, the Programs and Communications Director for the Newton Free Library. Thank you so much for tuning into this session on Searching for the Promised Land, the Great Migration, with author Davarian Baldwin. We're grateful to Historic Newton for partnering with us on this session, which is part of the Newton History Series. Mark your calendars. The series will continue on Thursday, March 25th at 7 p.m. with a talk by Allison K. Lang speaking about her book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. Please register on the library's virtual events calendar for that and any of our other many events for people of all ages at newtonfreelibrary.net. Just a few housekeeping notes. We ask that you remain muted during the session. We will be taking questions at the end via the chat feature, and do feel free to send us a chat if you need to ask a question in the interim about something technical. This session is being recorded, so we do recommend that you mute your videos. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Clara Silverstein, Historic Newton's Community Engagement Manager.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming on behalf of Historic Newton. I also thank the library for partnering with us and New TV for doing the live stream. We're honored to be able to present tonight's lecture by Davarian Baldwin during February, which is Black History Month. One upcoming program of note that Historic Newton is sponsoring is next Wednesday, March 3rd. It's funded by Mass Humanities, and it's a screening of Redeeming Uncle Tom, which is a film about Josiah Henson, whose life story inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write her novel. There's a discussion afterwards about how freedom seekers from slavery, like Henson, helped set the stage for activism in the 19th century. You can learn about that program and register through our website, historicnewton.org. And our calendar of many upcoming events is up to date there. If you'd like to be added to our mailing list for Historic Newton, you can email social@historicnewton.org. I'll put both of those in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Davarian Baldwin is the Paul E. Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College in Hartford. He's the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life, as well as the co-edited essay collection with Minka Mankalani, Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, and the forthcoming In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. He also serves as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and we're very pleased to welcome him tonight. So Davarian, it's time to take it away. You're muted, I think. You better.
Sorry about that. Welcome, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be quote unquote back in Boston. I live in Springfield currently, but I taught at Boston College for 10 years. In the early 2000s. And so it's wonderful to be in conversation with you all, especially during Black History Month. So I'm gonna share screen now and offer some imagery for you all to help you understand and process and receive the information that I'm gonna give to you today about the Harlem Renaissance, about the Great Migration, excuse me. And so the title of my talk for this evening, as was already told by Clara, and I want to thank Clara very much and the Newton Historical Society for bringing me here, is Searching for the Promised Land, the Great Migration. Here we have a gentleman by the name, sorry, hold on one second. I apologize. I'm sorry. It's been some kind of difficulty. Just give me one moment. I apologize in advance. Okay. Okay. I really apologize. Okay. Okay, there we go. So here is Mr. Casper Ferguson, who was born in Boston, grew up and lived in Roxbury, where his mother worked odd jobs at hotels and various workshops. He grew up becoming a nimble hockey player on Jamaica Pond, playing with friends of all backgrounds and races, African-American male, who ended up going to Boston College of all places, which was odd because Boston College had never really admitted or recruited African-American young people from Boston or anywhere else at this time in the early 1920s and 30s. And so he ended up going to Boston College and being interested in science and graduated with distinction. Everyone thought that he was going to be a scientist. He's extremely interested in the sciences and in laboratory work, but there were no laboratories in all of Boston who would hire him. He would go on to work at the Kenmore post office for 30 years, whereas he always had desired to be a scientist. Finally, after serving in World War II, later in life, he would eventually go on to work at a laboratory in Boston, distinguishing himself in extremely well terms. He ended up being the first African-American to graduate from Boston College, living a life of distinction after significant setbacks in the normal world that was America and Boston in the 1920s and 30s and there forward. And he actually lived and died with his wife in the historically Black area of West Newton, a place where his wife's family had lived since the Civil War. And so in some ways, his life is singular, but also in other ways, it is actually quite typical of the African-American experience in Boston, in Newton, and beyond, that he was a product. His family was from Virginia before they came to Boston and Roxbury, and then he eventually made his way to West Newton. This is a very typical story for African-Americans who ended up in the Boston area as a part of certain migration streams that we talk about, and I will discuss later on. This is a story that we know. This is a story whereby the individual African-Americans in Newton, in Boston, are part of this larger story that is called the Great Migration. Here we have this piece in the Liberator magazine entitled The Exodus from Dixie that looks at the Great Migration as a social movement, as something that was not just simply a search for jobs, but a resistance, a direct retort, a response to the conditions of Jim Crow living in the US South and in the search of more promised lands. I say lands in plural because there never was one place that was understood to be the promised land, but it was a continual search for promised lands in the face of racial restriction and white supremacist responses to Black excellence and attempts at equality. So this is a story of promised lands. The Great Migration can be understood in two great or large swaths of history. The first iteration of the Great Migration takes place between 1916 and 1930, whereby approximately 1.5 million African Americans went from southern towns and cities to northern cities. This is important because the story about the Great Migration that we most receive is the presumption that most African Americans that came to the North were rural and primitive and without an understanding of city life. And therefore, that was the rationale for placing them in subservient positions in the Northern industrial workplace. But that story is a myth. In this first iteration of the Great Migration, most African Americans came from southern towns and cities. They might not have understood the scale of life in a Boston or Chicago or New York, but they were hardly adverse or misunderstanding of urban conditions. In fact, 75% of African Americans that went to Chicago had higher rates of literacy than their white counterparts that came from the South and went to the North. So this is the first iteration of the Great Migration. The second iteration, what we call the Second Great Migration or the Greater Migration, takes place between 1940 and 1970, where approximately 4.5 million African Americans go from South to North. And this is the part we're more familiar with the movement from more rural areas to northern cities and towns. As you can see here on the left, there are much stronger what we call migration chains or streams that go from the South to the West Coast in places like Los Angeles and Seattle and Portland. But if you see here, you have, for example, the migration stream on the right, on the east, that is yellow. So this is why it's not a mistake whereby the majority of African Americans that are in Boston are from approximately 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, because these migration streams or chains start to develop a pattern whereby African Americans from certain states send word, create networks that build up linkages between certain states in the South and certain cities and towns in the North. I am from Wisconsin, so my family, not by surprise, was a part of the purple migration chain. Most of the people that I knew and their families were from the areas of Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee. And so these migration chains hold fast even to the recent present, as many African Americans are making their way back south in search of prosperity and opportunities after having lived decades in the urban North. But what's important to understand about this experience, these larger experiences of the Great Migration, is that we tend to talk about this as simply and completely a story of opportunity, of economic opportunity. That during World War II and World War I, immigration processes from Europe tightened up, which created an opportunity for industry to look south for African Americans to move from south to north. This is what we call push and pull factors. The argument primarily focuses on the pull factors. Opportunity in the north, African Americans were pulled from the south to the north by these pull factors. But what we don't look at enough are the push factors that push African Americans from south to north. The conditions of living under Jim Crow repression, the conditions of a Jim Crow life in terms of sexual violence, racial violence, and the related economic conditions of a second-class citizenship. That is not so much that African Americans were not agents of their own history, because we must remember approximately 12 million African Americans, 1.2 million African Americans left in the early period and 4.5 left in the second period of Great Migration. That means that most African Americans stayed. So those that left, they made decisions based on the conditions that were available. That yes, these opportunities to work in industry or have greater freedoms in the North were made available in certain time periods. But because most African Americans decided to stay with what they knew, as we would, if more job opportunities came above in, say, China or the Philippines, it would still have to be a decision to leave everything that we knew. And so we must continue to humanize African Americans as they decided and they weighed the pros and cons, even in the face of Jim Crow conditions in the South and economic opportunities in the North, about when, why, and what on what terms they would decide to move north. So these are some of the conditions I just talked about that were existing in the North, in the South, in terms of push factors. You had in the New South, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that offered the end of slavery, the offering of citizenship, and the right to vote, you had the New South. There were these things called Black Codes, whereby African Americans who were free to leave the old plantation were reconfined to the plantation if they did not have contracts with a white plantation owner that stated that they were basically owned or under contract by a white plantation owner. If they didn't have that, even if they had their own independent plot of land, they could be thrown in prison under vagrancy laws. So even if they had their land, by the cover of night, you had this process called white capping, whereby individuals in hoods or just on horseback, white individuals, would come and seize the land of African Americans and take it for themselves. And those African Americans who did not have a contract and were thrown into jail under the vagrancy laws, they were then leased out under the convict lease system. So thereby they were engaging in what we might call slavery by another name. They were free by law, but if we remember, the 13th Amendment says that there is no more slavery except for by punishment of a crime. So when vagrancy became a crime after emancipation, African Americans thrown into jail were leased out to private companies and to build public roads and bridges under the convict lease system. And this was the recreation of free labor. There was also the Jim Crow system. My grandfather was a sharecropper. This is a post-slavery plantation labor system whereby African Americans who freed themselves, former and formerly enslaved individuals, were thrown out into the world with few resources. So thereby, one of the few things they could do is engage in contract or sharecropping because they didn't own land, they didn't own the seed, they didn't own horses or plows. So they would rent land from a plantation owner and share the land, right, with the resulting crops. They would on credit, they would receive the plot of land, the seed, and the materials. And then at the end of harvest, they would have to square up their costs with the plantation owner. But because many African Americans couldn't maintain books, didn't know how to keep books, and also these negotiations were usually done at the end of a barrel of a gun, they were almost always in debt, which kept them bound to the land. So this was a totally inhumane, what we call debt peonage sharecropping system that kept African Americans bound to the land even after emancipation. There were also laws that existed from 1876 to 1865, so almost 100 years. This is after the 15th Amendment. A system of what was called separate and equal, but actually separate but unequal, whereby African Americans could not have access to the same public facilities like schools, restaurants, water fountains, sometimes even the same roads. And this was the condition for almost 100 years. African Americans by law had the right to vote, but they were subjected to poll taxes at the voting booth or literacy tests, whereby they would have to recite by memory pieces of the state constitution. Now, we know that most white people couldn't do this as well. So there was this thing called the grandfather clause, whereby if there was someone in your family who could vote before 1865, then you were grandfathered in to not have to take a literacy test. Why 1865? Because that is the year of the 14th Amendment, offering the right to vote for African Americans. So people talk about slavery or racism as being something about ignorance. Well, I just didn't know. If I knew, then I would do better. Hopefully you'll see here the conditions of life under Jim Crow. It was not about ignorance. Racism was about knowledge. At every moment when African Americans had the opportunity to advance, there was a white supremacist response based on a knowledge and awareness of how to keep African Americans not only bound to the land in their labor, but also under subservient positions within public, social, and economic life. There was also racial violence, just the general realities of lynch law. There was a race riots in New Orleans in 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, race riots in New York City in 1900, and also race riots in Atlanta in 1906. All different ways, technologies of violence to maintain a social order and an economic order of white supremacy and Black subservience. So these are the conditions under which people made the decision to leave, or they would say to quit the South. Here are some wonderful pictures of those on their way and those who arrived in cities. The migration story is extremely important, whereby in New York, in the period between 1915 and 1930, there were over 200,000 African-American migrants that came into the city of New York. In Chicago, over 100,000 came in that time period. And by comparison, Boston's numbers were much smaller. And particularly in Newton, there were, in the Boston area, there was a rise in about 10,000 in this time period. But while the numbers were smaller, the impact was significant. That the vision, the visibility, the presence of African Americans at such, compared to their invisibility in years before, had a profound impact on what it meant to be a Bostonian and what it meant to be from Newton in particular. Here we have a bit of a map from Boston, whereby we can see in this map that the neighborhoods where African Americans primarily located were in the South End of Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, and then after World War II and African Americans gained some strength, some sense of upper mobility, it would move further into Mattapan. Now, as we all know, because you all are great Newton residents, you can't see Newton here on the map fully, but that little purple area on the edge of Brighton to the west of Brighton is the corner of Newton. So just to get a sense of the relationship between the neighborhoods where African Americans predominated and your home neighborhood and town of Newton. The response initially to this African American presence all over the country was violent resistance. So African Americans had left an environment of violence, only to enter into a new level of violence by 1919. As we have here these two images from the Black-owned Messenger magazine, 1919 also called the Bloody Summer, when there were race rioting hotspots, over 25, all over the country, going as far away as Liverpool, England, when white Americans in northern and southern cities responded to a growing Black presence with the Great Migration with violence. On the left hand, we have a powerful image of white Americans in World War II soldier regalia, in military regalia, beating African Americans in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, with Black leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois looking on. On the right hand, the image from a month later in the same magazine shows a picture of an African American in an armored car with a flag, not the American flag, but a flag of the various locations where riots had taken place. And African Americans are fighting back against those they call the Hun. The term the Hun is important here because it's the term that America used against their German enemies during World War II. And so here we have African Americans using the term Hun to speak back to their enemies, which were white Americans, in an armored car that is called the New Negro. The term New Negro here was important because it's also a term that we associate with the literary and cultural renaissance that was primarily situated in Harlem, but took place all over the country. On the left, we have the opening cover for the original survey graphic that announced the New Negro movement as an artistic and cultural movement. On the right, we have a picture of a parade in 1925 by Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, whereby it says with a placard, "The New Negro has no fear." We come to know the New Negro movement as a space of migrants in the urban North as primarily being a cultural and literary movement of Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Aaron Douglas and others. But it was a cultural, social, and political movement. It was an expression of a new Negro spirit that articulated itself in a range of ways, as we see here in this powerful image of the magazine cover and the social protest. Marcus Garvey was a powerful central figure in this new Negro movement, not a migrant from the South, but an immigrant from Jamaica who took forward a vision of Black nationalism that included a expression of African Americans. If you're not being treated correctly in the North and in the South, we need to go back to Africa. But even for those African Americans who didn't adhere to a back to Africa piece of his movement, he also espoused a vision of self-determination, that we need Black-owned businesses, Black-owned schools, Black-owned institutions, and Black images in churches and in our cultural magazines and in our art, because that will be the pathway to creating a resilient Black vision and Black existence in a world that shows African Americans as second class and inferior. It's important that a strong adherent to the UNIA was George McGuire, who became the leader in Boston, and particularly in Roxbury, of the African Orthodox Church. He broke away from the Episcopal Church and created an independent African church with visions of Jesus as Black, of stories that focus on Black people and Black rituals and Black religious beliefs, embedded within an Episcopal framework. So this is important to understand how this international vision, the UNIA went as far away as reaching out to Aboriginal peoples in Australia with this Negro World magazine and its various membership bodies all over the world. But it also touched Boston through George McGuire and the African Orthodox Church. Boston New Negroes can be seen both here in the form of Pauline Hopkins' Colored American magazine and William Rowe Trotter's Liberator newspaper. That while we look at Harlem as an articulation of the New Negro movement, it also touched Boston and actually predated the explosion of art and politics in Harlem in the 20s. These iterations of Boston's movement go back to the turn of the 20th century, as early as 1899, where the Colored American magazine put Black art and Black agitation in an entertaining format of the magazine. And the agitator, William Rowe Trotter, was even to the left of W.E.B. Du Bois in his resilient insistence on Black equality, even in the so-called cradle of liberty that Boston claimed to be, where African Americans still continue to face second-class citizenship. So as we move forward to the later period during World War II and the Greater Migration, we see a various number of ways in which African Americans stamped their position and their imprint on northern cities, including Boston. Here we have the segregation of African Americans into major urban centers being transformed into what the historian Earl Lewis says, it became congregation. So by being concentrated and contained within Black enclaves, whether it be the thoroughfares of State Street in Chicago, or 125th in Harlem, or Central Ave in LA, or Blue Hill Ave in Roxbury, this was a process of segregation. But in the face of that, African Americans turned that space of segregation and turned it into congregation. Here we have a young Malcolm Little in Roxbury. When he arrived in Boston, either in 1940 or 1941, this young Malcolm Little was no older than 16 years old. He went on to live with his older half-sister, Ella Collins. And here we have him in front of her two-flat house at 72 Dale Street in Roxbury, which still stands and has become a historic landmark by the city of Boston. Malcolm had been dazzled by the bright lights of downtown Roxbury, like many have been with their downtowns in Black communities all over the country. This is not a picture of downtown Roxbury, but it signifies the energy and spirit of these Black strips of commercial entertainment life that can be found all over the country in major urban metropolises. So of the Roxbury area, Malcolm remarked, "I didn't know the world contained as many Negroes as I saw thronging downtown Roxbury at night, especially on Saturdays. Neon lights, nightclubs, pool halls, bars, the cars they drove, restaurants made the streets smell rich, greasy, down-home Black cooking. Juice boxes blared Erskine Hawkins, Duke Ellington, Cotty Williams, dozens of others." Well, we all should know that this Malcolm Little ended up becoming Malcolm X, the leader of the Nation of Islam and later of Orthodox Islam, who espoused a vision of Black political self-determination. His mother and father were members of the Garvey movement years earlier, and he carried this forward as a member of the Nation of Islam, that he put forward an international vision of Black liberation, that whereby he cut his teeth on seeing injustice, inequality, but also Black possibility in his time in Roxbury, Boston. By World War II, we had people like Malcolm and others drawn to wartime industrial possibilities in the cities, things that African Americans had to fight for. As African Americans came and migrated to these cities, they saw that all this prosperity that was being generated by the wartime economy, yet they were still relegated to a second-class position. And so out of this came the original March on Washington, not Martin Luther King, but labor activist A. Philip Randolph pushed forward a politics of self-determination and independence from white control on factory floors. African Americans in places like Detroit, in Chicago, in Boston, New York, LA, port cities and towns and areas, and it's particularly at war industries on the home front, began organizing for a national right that African Americans should have their equal access to this wartime prosperity. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph organized over 100,000 African Americans for a threatened March on Washington to demand jobs in the rapidly expanding defense industries. He didn't have to fulfill that threat because in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Act, which offered fair employment committees in all industries that had been retrofitted for industrial employment and labor and were receiving federal contracts. This reality was important because it was a part of a larger Black campaign, for example, the Double V campaign, that in response to Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination, African Americans said, we are engaging in a Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and domestic fascism at home, racism at home. That if we are going to be America, we're going to be spreading in the saviors of democracy, we have to start at home. And one of the main fertile grounds for that battle was the Charleston Navy Yards. During wartime, some African Americans went to the rail yards or the domestic sphere. They brought their blacksmithing skills and their shipbuilding skills from places like Norfolk, Virginia, where they had been trained already. They came to Boston with these skill sets, but they faced discrimination until Executive Order 8802 and the Double V campaign. Ultimately, because of agitation on the streets, approximately 2,000 African American civilians found employment in 1943, but this was out of a total of 47,000 people that were employed at the Charleston Navy Yards. They worked as clerks, electrician helpers, mechanics, and welders. And the struggle continued. Women workers like Mabel Kahn and Helen Lee Franklin directly fought discrimination at the Charleston Navy Yards. When they felt mistreated, passed over for promotions, or segregated as clerks, they took advantage of Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, or pulled on community organizations like the NAACP to bring attention to racial discrimination at the yard floor, shop floor. In both examples, the Fair Employment Committee said they didn't have enough evidence to prove discrimination, yet they maintain their existence and their agitation remains for us a legacy about the reality that laws on the books are not enough until they're enforced, and they must be enforced by people agitating and making them whole and making them real. African Americans also faced the housing realities of redlining. Here we have this powerful image of a redlining map in the Boston area. If you look to your far left on the western corner in the green, you can see the Newton Country Club in the green surrounded by blue. This redlining map was used by the federal government to identify areas that were secure and insecure for federal subsidies when it came to investment and housing mortgages to spur the economy. This policy was created by the Federal Housing Authority that goes back to the 30s and 40s, but really takes shape in the 50s and 60s. The problem with this is that we see these four colors. The red zone areas were those areas that were deemed to be unfit for security and investment. The blue and the green areas were the areas that were considered to be fit for investment. Banks used these maps to decide who they would give loans to in terms of investment or in terms of home mortgages. Originally, it was thought that the evaluation of certain areas for security purposes was based on housing stock, the quality of housing in the neighborhoods. But we quickly find out that the true criteria for these maps was the racial makeup of the neighborhoods. The racial makeup of the neighborhoods in terms of not being majority Black, but having just simply one or two Black families in areas could make the area get marked as red or being a no-go area for banks to invest their money. This map, this investment structure set the terms for economic prosperity and investment that exists to this day. So for here we see the map takes shape whereby when the 1968 Federal Housing Act required the no longer usage of these maps, bankers and investors then instituted what was called the Boston Banks Urban Renewal Group in 1968. What did this group do? Well, they said, well, if we have to loan or offer loans to African Americans, we are going to target the neighborhood of Dorchester and Roxbury for these loans, and particularly Jewish neighborhoods, whereby we are going to inflate, we're going to panic sell, we're going to encourage panic in the neighborhood to encourage those white homeowners to sell low because there's a threat. We're gonna spur fear of the influx of an African American population. So we're gonna do that. They're gonna sell low. We're gonna buy them with these federal loans, right? Then we're gonna sell high to African Americans, and we're not going to allow them to inspect the homes. So they're going to move into these homes above market rate, above their means, that are already beginning to deteriorate. And then we are going to push the white individuals who left these neighborhoods into neighborhoods in the suburbs that are already owned by select banks. So these banks and real estate holders got money coming and going. And then when the homes went into foreclosure because they charged above the means of African Americans and above the means of the market, they rebought the homes and started the cycle all over again. Also, African Americans, once they got into these neighborhoods, had to face segregated schools through unjust neighborhood school policy zoning. Black and Puerto Rican students were called primitive children. They were supposedly from culturally deprived homes. These neighborhoods these neighborhood schools existed with 20-year-old schools, poorly equipped, overcrowded, substitute teachers, and vocational training or tracking in certain Black or Black-oriented neighborhoods. And in fact, the origins of busing was whereby if white students in these neighborhoods in Boston had to go to schools that have Black populations, busing was originally used to get white children out of these neighborhoods to go to all white better schools. That was the original use of busing. So in the face of these conditions of education, you have a series of nationwide Black boycotts and protests, not in the South. This is after Brown v. Board in the 60s, in New York in 68, a 10,000 person rally in Boston in 63, a Chicago Freedom Day walkout in 65 of 200,000 Black students walking out, a walkout in 68 in East Los Angeles of Chicano students. This was the response to the racially uneven access to educational equity. In Boston, this set the terms for images like this. You can't tell which one is Little Rock, Arkansas, and which one is Southie Boston. But I'll tell you, the one on the left is Boston, the one on the right is Little Rock, Arkansas. But you can barely tell the difference in the resistance to the equalizing of school access. People leave with the consumption after the Boston busing legacy that African Americans simply wanted to be bused into white schools. But that was not the case. African Americans wanted educational equity, and they saw how resources, both in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of labor, followed white bodies into white populations. And so they knew that, so they wanted their children bused. They started out with carpools to get their children into the schools where the resources followed. Many say in oral histories that if the resources had been equitable in Black neighborhoods, there would have been no need for busing. But because resources have been redistributed to white neighborhoods and areas, this is where they needed to be to get educational equity. This comes to a full head when Dr. Martin Luther King came to Boston in 1965 to march on Boston Commons. And his vision, as generated not by him, but by Boston area students, teachers, and parents, was this vision of educational equity that combined educational equity, anti-poverty planning, the desegregation of public housing, and the building for social justice. This was a comprehensive vision of social justice that has simply been whittled down into an idea of equality under the law. But this was a comprehensive vision of equal access to housing, to healthcare, to education, to jobs. And this is the legacy that we inherit to this day. This is the reason why we're still talking about Black Lives Matter in places like Boston, all over the country, because the legacy of the migrants in areas like Boston and their political vision was not fully realized. And so the legacy continues. This is why you can have a Black Lives Matter sign in suburban areas like Newton that are predominantly white. Why? Because of the history of redlining and educational inequality. You don't need to say we don't want Black people in our neighborhoods. You can, because of a history of residential and educational segregation in the current moment, you can hide, not you, but we can hide behind seemingly race neutral ideas like zoning, right? That, well, it just so happens that in Newton, there is a two parking space requirement to live in Newton. That when you buy a home, it has to be a certain size plot. It has to be a certain size. There has to be a certain setback. Certain neighborhoods are historic districts. All these things raise the value and the price of the homes, that we zone for single family homes instead of multi-family homes or apartment homes, or only in certain parts of the neighborhoods. Why are most apartments concentrated in West Newton? Because that was the area where African Americans were allowed to live going back to the 1880s. So we hide behind seemingly race neutral policies like zoning that then allow for a neighborhood to have Black Lives Matter signs in all white neighborhoods that are built on these older arrangements that responded to resistance against and the resiliency of African Americans during the Great Migration. And so hence the struggle continues. Thank you.
Varian, that was so powerful.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you so much for everything that you shared. I would like to invite the participants to put questions in the chat. You can chat to me directly or Clara Silverstein, and then we will pose the questions to the Varian. We have about a little more than 10 minutes for the Q&A.
I got a question from someone who was looking at the magazines that you had posted, the ones that were published in Boston, and
Yes.
wondered if anything like that still exists. Both of those are long gone, but
Yeah.
is that still a common way that people communicate with each other?
Well, for years, there was the Bay State Banner as the predominant African-American journalist account. But we know now with the fall of journalism in general, newspapers are barely holding on. But we do see in the digital sphere, the resurgence, particularly amongst young people, that the fervent that became Black Lives Matter in cities all over the country was a product of young people engaging on the streets and in the digital sphere through zines, through blogs, through websites, through TikTok videos, that they are the new iteration of Colored American Magazine within what we call Black Twitter, if you will, or within segmented aspects of a larger digital sphere. We see the resurgence of these, what we call a public sphere, a space of discourse and dialogue that caters to particular communities. They never go away. They just morph and react to new conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody is asking, during the Great Migration, Alex is asking, did anyone migrate to other countries like Canada?
Yeah, great question. There were earlier migrations to Canada right after slavery, but during the 1920s, there were significant groups of African Americans who came to the North and were dissatisfied with what they thought was going to be a promised land. And small pockets of individuals went to places like Paris, Berlin, and particularly after 1917, people began to hear about this project whereby this new republic in Eastern Europe, right, where the workers had taken over the country from the crown, and that it was a workers' republic that was governing without regards to race or class difference, the Soviet Union. There are a significant amount of African Americans that went to the Soviet Union, and there's some interesting memoirs of their descendants who live there either today or in other parts of the world that tell the story of their family members who made that trek to the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, and then eventually left during the pogroms of the 50s and 60s during World War II and after. So that is a very interesting story. There are stories about African Americans who went to Germany, who ended up in internment camps, or who fled right before not the Nazi rule. So yeah, we're global, continually searching for that promised land. And it wasn't always in the US, even in the North.
Sue is asking, can you tell us more about West Newton as an African American center of population? When did this begin? I think you spoke a little bit about that, but maybe she's looking for more detail.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have enough detail. That is the project and the story that needs, I encourage you all from this to go tell that story. We do know that the population in West Newton goes back to the Civil War. It was a small enclave. And as I said before, it was a highly literate and educated population of professionals and skilled tradesmen and women that lived in that area. I think if we do some map overlays, it's really interesting to talk about how, the areas that are lower in housing value are those same areas where African Americans populated West Newton over 100 years ago to this day, right? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted, if you're done, to point out that Historic Newton has done some walking tours and programs about the historically Black community in West Newton.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I mean, I don't mean to say there hasn't been work done. I'm just saying there could be more. We could continually do more work.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank y'all for doing that work.
Yeah.
And there's more to be done.
Right.
Very interesting question that bears having me read the entire comment from Athea, who says, I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm an African American woman. I used to live in Waltham. When we were looking for a house in a Black area of a suburban area, we considered West Newton. However, according to the Boston Globe Spotlight team's article entitled, Is Boston Racist? Current Black middle-class zones were mapped. However, the West Newton Black neighborhood was no longer considered a middle-class Black zone. What happened? We ended up buying in Milton.
Yeah, so this story we're talking about in terms of redlining, whereby because of the redlining maps, the Black community existed before the redlining maps, but when we overlay those maps on top of these communities, it was while your peers and your neighbors, maybe distant neighbors, are able to get second mortgages on your homes to reinvest and make improvements. African Americans in the red areas couldn't take advantage of that, right? They couldn't, the values of their homes didn't appreciate at the same rate as homes of the exact same square footage and exact same quality, maybe down the street, because of the legacy of redlining and the divestment that came after that. And it's not a surprise, just to continue the story forward, that the very same neighborhoods that had been redlined were the ones that were targeted with inferior financial products during the housing crisis of 2009. So the very same people that had been excluded from equitable housing or financial services then got targeted with inferior subprime mortgages And then we ended up blaming Black people for the housing crisis because they tried to live above their means. But even African Americans with good credit scores in West Newton, if you live in a certain neighborhood, you can only get mortgages at a certain rate. So we go from redlining for 60 years to reverse redlining for 20 years. And then comes the financial crisis, the housing crisis in 2009. So this is an enduring, it's not the same. Racism is intelligent. It's not about ignorance. It transforms and morphs in response to Black efforts at equality and justice. It's knowledgeable, it's knowing, it's nimble. And we really need to understand that simply learning about African Americans is not enough. That's a very American principle. Well, if I just knew better, I'd do better. Racism knows about Black people, but how do we capitalize on racial difference? How do we extract wealth inequitably from Black people when we can? That's the story we need to tell. So thank you, Afia, for that question.
And she further asks, she asked about the development of the Mass Pike that went right through Newton and basically decimated the village, which was an historically African-American community here in Newton.
Right.
And I know that another one of our racial justice organizations, Forge, is having a program on that coming up soon. So check their website for information on that. But Afia wants to know, do you think the development of the interstate killed the middle-class Black zone?
Yeah. I mean, all over the country, if we go look up and down the Eastern Seaboard, 95, Interstate 95, in every city up and down the Eastern Seaboard, the location of the overpasses and the highways are in historically Black neighborhoods. Every city, from Miami to Boston, right? And Boston also goes through a historically Italian neighborhood in the North End. But decisions were made about which neighborhoods were expendable, which communities could be cut through. And then when the neighborhoods were, when the highways were built and these Black people relocated, the very same banks that invested in their removal had the opportunity to move them into new neighborhoods for which they own the deeds. So they got the money coming and going. It's amazing. It's awesome in the worst sense of the word.
Barry wants to know if those banks are still in business.
That's right. And so when people now talking about reparations and repair and economic justice, this is what they mean. We're not talking about a handout or welfare. We're talking about the fact that a significant amount of this country's economic wealth, way past slavery, has been extracted inequitably from Black communities. And to be made whole, there must be economic repair that takes into account the wealth that was taken from these neighborhoods and the wealth that they lost in terms of accumulation over the time through interest and inheritance.
This is actually an interesting question to follow that up that Kate was asking. She's following up on what you said about zoning and how so much of Newton is zoned residential, single family home, right. With the setbacks and all of large this.
Setbacks, large lot sizes. Yep.
Right. So
parking restrictions.
Right.
I remember when I moved to go to teach at BC, I wanted to live in Newton, and I found out about the parking requirement, and that was the restriction. I couldn't live there. It was too expensive. It was cost. So go ahead. Sorry.
No, so she's definitely wanting you to follow up on that. And so she's asking, what are moves that Newton residents who care about racial justice, the people who have the Black Lives Matter signs out, how can we promote more diversity in our city?
Yeah.
What can we do about housing policy to maybe address some of the problems that you've so well laid out?
There have been some great movement, especially after the summer, in places like Connecticut, which is one of the most wealth disparate states in the country, between poverty and prosperity, between, like, say, Greenwich and Hartford. And activists all over in the urban areas are calling for inclusionary policy zoning laws that right now in Massachusetts, if towns don't include affordable housing in their neighborhoods, they can lose certain state monies. But because towns like Newton and other towns are so wealthy, they say we'd rather not take the money versus build affordable housing. That's a fact, right? And so we need inclusionary zoning mandates that require all cities in the state to share in the distribution of affordable housing, multifamily housing, and apartment housing. We need to rezone for more multifamily, more diverse housing opportunities away from the standard of single family, large lot size zoning. We need to argue that if you're going to build new developments in the town, whether it be commercial or house or residential, that there must be money that is set aside from those developments that is put into an affordable housing trust so that towns can build affordable housing in their neighborhoods. The biggest pushback is going to be from residents themselves that are going to argue that different kinds of housing are going to diminish their property values. And so we need to have open forums and bring back people like myself and others to have the hard conversations about the racial roots that get coded in claims about property value increasing and decreasing. The roots of that.
Yeah, okay. Ellen, do you have more questions from the chat?
Yes, and I appreciate all the information that you're bringing to us today, Devarian, because of the discussion that Newton is undergoing right now about redesigning our zoning. It's been ongoing for a while, and I think it's great for people to hear this perspective. And Kate wants to know if you have data on wealth lost to African Americans as a result of redlining. Also, what was the period when redlining had the most impact in Newton?
Yeah, I don't have data. That data has to be compiled on a national level. Because of the size of Newton, I'm sure Newton is not on the radar. People are just compiling data right now for like cities like Chicago and St. Louis. But it's something that needs to be done. This is the work of like graduate students at BC, at Tufts, at Harvard, at MIT, in the urban planning department. This is the kind of work they should be doing as service to these communities. So let me just start by saying that the years or the decades that had the greatest impact would be the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So if we look at that Beberg program that targeted the Jewish community in Dorchester for panic selling, that was in 68. The residential security maps I showed you go back to the 30s, but they really ramp up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s after the wealth that comes from World War II, and banks had greater capital to offer federally insured housing mortgages, especially after World War II, where white soldiers came back with the GI Bill money that allowed them to go into suburbs and buy homes at a low rate, a program that African Americans were, surprise, surprise, discriminated against in terms of access to it. There were a few African Americans that got access to the GI Bill, but all white American soldiers had access to the GI Bill. And that was not the case for African Americans. This is how we built the suburbs, y'all, right? We say we don't know how to do public policy, but after World War II, it was federal money. It's probably the biggest demonstration of welfare, of socialism in the history of the world, right? State money built the American middle class after World War II. And now in the present, when the complexion of those who need upward mobility is changed, we say we don't know how to do it. We do. We did it. We did it for white America after World War II. We built the American middle class with federal money. We can do it again.
Interesting.
Claire, did you have any final questions? We are almost at the end here.
I think what I didn't see anything in the chat, but I think it might be interesting as a wrap up for you to kind of go full circle to the Great Migration, where people were really in search of a better life.
Yeah.
There was the push out and then the pull too with the jobs and so on. Do you think your ancestor, who was the sharecropper, what would this person say now? What is some of the legacy of that
Yeah.
migration?
Right.
Certainly, you've made it very clear that a lot of the promise really didn't fulfill itself, but
Mhm.
what are some of
I mean, for my family, one of the biggest legacies is me. 3 generations from a sharecropper to a PhD. But it's always conditioned because amongst my peers, my white peers, they have greater wealth because their family could give them the down payment on their home. Their family put aside money for their education. Whereas in my story, I'm success, but my wealth means something different because a portion of my wealth is expected to go back to my family. Right? So success, no question, but always conditioned along racial and economic lines. And I definitely think, yes, there are tons of success stories. Oscar Micheaux, Madam C.J. Walker, Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, John Coltrane, Malcolm X. These are all success stories of the Great Migration. But it never came without a conditioned level. It was never equal to their white peers. And we need to be clear about that. Right? We love Hollywood endings, but this is not that.
Well, thank you for presenting such an enlightening program and giving us all a lot to think about. We really appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Thank you all for attending.
And really quickly, if anybody has questions, follow up. My first name, Devarian.Baldwin. And maybe you have to put it in the chat at TRINCOLL.edu. Devarian.Baldwin@trincall.edu. If you have follow-up questions or comments, I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Devarian. I'm just putting that in the chat.
Yeah, great.
Oh, I just did. We both did,
Okay,
but that's fine.
So,
Perfect.
and I also want to point out that I did put a list of Devarian's books and publications in the chat. So I'm just going to keep talking for a moment. So those of you who are interested can see that list. We encourage you to either borrow them from the library or approach your local indie bookstore if you'd like to purchase them.
Not Amazon, go indie.
That's right. Devarian, it's been a pleasure to work with you and very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.